So, as I think you all know, you should have 3 ports in front of you. There's a white one, a 10-year-old tawny, and a vintage. Obviously, what we're going to taste will be what's in the glass, but I guess we'd also like to encourage you to see these wines as if you like, generic examples. We all have the same wines except for the first one, but I'll point that out as we go along. After we taste each wine, I'd like to encourage you to share your thoughts, especially with respect to things like serving occasions and food pairings. So without further ado, let's start with that white one. I have Vista Alegre. I think most people have Vasquez de Carvalho. And this is a blend. It's interesting. I was thinking when Paolo was talking about grape varieties, I think because of the blending, in a way, even obviously the grape varieties are important, we don't always talk about them. You know, when you're talking about port maybe to a consumer, we don't necessarily talk about varieties because in a way, maybe the blend is more important. But for what it's worth, this is Vozinho, Malvasia, Gouveia, Arinto, Social, and Rabigato. That's certainly what I've got, and I'm not. I think you've probably got a pretty similar blend if you don't have the same one as me. Alcohol is 20% or 19.5. Sugars are about the same, around about 50 grams per litre, and that's probably enough. Now let's actually taste this wine. The first thing that slightly amused me about this was that it looks tawny, you know, and here we are talking, and I think that's one of the things we slightly have to get our heads around, that white port sometimes looks a bit like tawny. Anyway, let's have a look. So it is quite bright, quite clear, tawny. I mean, I would maybe call this amber more than brown. And then when you smell it, it's sort of richly fruity, dried fruits and nuts, maybe a bit of caramelized orange peel. And I think if you can still find some sort of lingering primary fruit aromas, maybe something grapey, and then it's something slightly floral, I think. When you taste, it's sweet, but it's not over the top sweet. I want to say bittersweet, but perhaps in the poetic sense. I could talking maybe about the sense of caramel or burnt sugar rather than actually bitter. But again, you know, maybe again talking to consumers, I think people often get confused about what bitterness truly is. So in that sense, it probably works. Whereas for me, I think bitterness is generally a negative thing when it comes to wine. I think again, in terms of flavour, you're finding, as you expect from those, some of that sort of caramelized orange or maybe kumquat peel. It's quite smooth, it's quite rounded. There's discernible alcohol. I'm hoping that you're all drinking it at a cooler temperature. I think this actually deserves to be served not super cold, but certainly cool, lightly chilled if you like. Quite a nice length to it. It's not hugely complex, but there are definitely layers. I'm really keen to get some feedback on this. So if you'd like to say something, please do unmute yourself. I'm kind of interested too in I guess, some other factors. So for example, you know, I think there's quite a range of aromas when it comes to white port and style. Definitely we've got these oxidative notes, things like toffee and caramel, maybe some citrus, maybe some apple, maybe some honey. And then again, sort of maybe a bit of herb even, and more spice. Now, where do these flavors come from? Obviously, something comes from the grapes, but also this oxidative aging, I think, is really important. And I guess, given that you guys will be doing some blind tasting with these, I think it's important to say, well, what other style is like this? And maybe why is it not that style? Now, if you looked at this immediately, you might say it's tawny, as we've said, because it's a bit of a clue in the color. So why not tawny? I would say I would expect, obviously, if we had a white port with lots of age, maybe we'd get more complexity. But generally speaking, I think you'd expect more complexity from a tawny. Paolo, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, about why you why you obviously wouldn't say, because you could be slightly tricked, but why wouldn't you? What are the arguments?
The trade is, especially when it comes to blind tasting, or even when the trade is also challenging us because it's almost showing as a tawny with some nuances, and these nuances are you talked a lot about what they are, but usually, and even for sommeliers and the food services, that we are aiming for a wine that, of course, it comes from white grapes, so it will be less structured than a tawny. Less structured to the extent that we have a more subtle wine, a more delicate wine, with some hints to the tawny world. But actually, it is not a tawny because it's smoother, it's with less structure, doesn't have the weight of the being born in red grapes. And the other thing is, of course, it will come to the caramel side and to the cooking side of an aged wine because it has the Maillard reactions and all of the reactions of an oxidative wine. And in the end of the day, in 50, 60 years or 40 years, they will come closer. But because it comes from white grapes, it will still have the floral approach, some fruity to the side of citrus. And it will be less probably nutty also, but not to the caramel and the weight and the length of a very spicy or curry side. And I think that's what is interesting when you are able to propose a white dry, in this case a dry white that has some age, because it's a lighter wine than a tawny, and you probably think tawnies for desserts. But if you have a light dessert in the menu, or even as the first course or an entree, this could work.
Which leads me nicely onto pairings. This is where I'd be really keen to have feedback from you. But clearly, I'm hoping you've all had the chance to sample Port Tonic, which is a fine drink. But I think you could treat this as an aperitif. In fact, the French love to serve white port as an aperitif. Maybe we're a little behind them on that here. But I think you can think of things like almonds, smoked almonds, toasted almonds, maybe some ham, particularly of cured or air dried ham. And again, maybe even rolling into a first course, things like smoked fish. I'm really keen to hear if anyone's either got some ideas or some particular example they've had of a match that works for them with a white port. Anyone? Antonio's looking really thoughtful, like he has a really good answer.
They are all shy.
Okay. We do think about that, because at the end we can come back and have a bit more of a talk about this.
If I may, I've worked in places there. So we're talking about like tawny and color and the aging process being similar to a red tawny. I've worked in places that really focused on orange wines and skin contact and a bit more robust on the whites. And the thing is that they weren't always approachable as by itself or looking at on a wine list. But I worked in a place where we had a half roast chicken with Cavolo Nero and hazelnuts, and it was very herbaceous, very nutty. So like, even if you don't want to go with the straightaway charcutes or cheese pairings with ports, right when I tasted this, it reminded me of that dish. So very herby, very bitter on the leaves, but a little bit of structured white can kind of help with that.
Yeah, that's great. It was interesting when you were talking about Cavolo Nero, because I love Cavolo Nero, but that definitely does have a bitterness to it. And I think that can be really quite challenging for wine. So I think that's a really, really good idea, actually. And I think going into main courses, I think we sometimes get a bit paranoid about sweetness in wines, when in fact, there is an argument they could work really, really well. Obviously, if you think about it and make a good choice, it's not just some kind of random thing. But yeah, I think that's a really good idea. Thank you.
There is also one thing that this wine and Vasco de Carvalho also, for those who have Vasco de Carvalho, but actually there are to the port world, they are quite young because they are dry whites. They have 6-7 years old, and actually the color comes from skin contact also, not only the aging of the wine, which is very interesting that you were saying that they are younger, and you can feel it in the palate that they are younger than they look. Because of that, because we are not talking about the aged white port, we're talking about a dry white port that should be aimed a little bit as an aperitif, but already with some structure and some depth in it. So it's
just a brilliant interjection from Antonio there. He thought the bitterness of sea urchin would work really well with this. I'm liking that thought, actually, because sea urchin's quite challenging, isn't it? You've made me hungry now. It's early in the day. I have to go out and find some sea urchin, I think. That's great. Just one more point. Paolo,
yeah.
Do you think it's fair to say that maybe port as an industry takes white port a bit more seriously these days? Or is that, is that an unfair? My sense is when I started out, white port was kind of just something on the side that people had it, but they didn't really talk about it and take it that seriously. Would that be fair?
Definitely. Now they are paying much more attention, and even I would say if I'm allowed to say, the English houses that for some years didn't care about white ports, and now we can see that they are being more focused a little bit more and investing a little bit more on white ports. So yes. And that's why we are also, for the UK market, that is also a challenge, because our brain goes immediately to ruby ports, and we have a wide range of wines to work with, and even to show to the consumer and to our clients that there are completely different things that they probably never heard about. But yes, the trade is investing much more in white ports.
Yeah. Antonio's pointed out that sometimes he's matched sea urchin with Fino sherry, and I have to say, I was thinking earlier, maybe I shouldn't talk about sherry on a port conversation, but
no worries.
I was thinking about Fino sherry, and I think much as I love Fino sherry, and I think probably a lot of us do, I think sometimes its absolute searing dryness is maybe a bit problematic for some consumers, and I think that white port offers a really interesting alternative, precisely because it's got some sweetness in there, even though the sweetness isn't balanced. But I think it's a if you're thinking Fino or Manzanilla, I think white port definitely has a role to play in that kind of spectrum, part of the spectrum.
And also the question regarding the Manzanillas and the Chinos, the Finos, they can enhance the seaside, the salinity of the sea urchins or the scallop. The scallops not that, but the sardines also. So probably we could find a more balanced or a wider range of pairing perspective on a dry white or an extra dry white port, which is about 35 grams of sugar per liter. Because Fino may just enhance the seaside of the for one side it's good, from the other side probably it's too much on the pairing.
And possibly our last white port pairings with a cigar. Well done, Emmanuel. But I think that's I think for me one of the challenges with fortified wines is that people often don't know when to drink them, and I think if you can find non-traditional, non-obvious occasions, then I think it's not just about making the sale. Obviously we're keen to make the sale, but I always think in terms of customer satisfaction. If you can show somebody a pairing that they hadn't thought about doing, then and they enjoy it, then you've given them a better time. So I think that for me it's this sort of, if you like, that incremental sale, that finding that new opportunity or that new occasion is as much as part of making customers happy and customer service as it is of putting the extra pounds through the till, which obviously these days we have to think about too, clearly. Okay, shall we move on and try our second port? And what's interesting here, I think, is coming back to our point about tawny, my first impression when I opened this morning was, well, it's not tawny. And I think that's, that it's a good reminder that, that tawny in particular has a range of colors that extend beyond tawny, if you like. This one here has big blend. It's Tinta Barocca, Tinta Rurish, Touriga Franca, Touriga Nacional, and some others, made very much in the traditional style. It's 20% alcohol, acidity 4.58, 115 grams per litre residual sugar. So let's have a taste. I guess I'd call this maybe garnet, sort of tending towards brick, maybe. And there's definitely, you're beginning to see some development, you're beginning to see some oxidative notes, but it's still quite fruity, I think. There's plenty of ripe fruit, confit fruit, maybe sort of mixed berry jam, maybe some blueberry, and a little hint of hedgerow. And I have to say, hedgerow for me encompasses, I guess, complex fruit aromas, but also something slightly earthy, something slightly herbaceous. I guess the French might say sous-bois. What do you say in Portuguese? Or sottobosco in Italian.
Yeah, we call it chão de floresta, which means forest ground.
Yeah, so there's that note there, which to me is I like it. Always adds more interest for me. You can definitely sense some spirit here. It seems higher than the white port, but actually it's not very much higher, interestingly. Some subtle spice notes. In the mouth, it's black fruit, maybe a little bit of red. When I was tasting earlier, I wrote down very port, which is hardly a surprise, but sometimes you have to write what you think. Like it does taste like port. I don't think it could be anything else if someone just poured some in a glass. There's a pleasing sweetness, and it's got some balancing grit and pretty decent acidity. And I think sometimes we take it for granted when we taste port, but clearly both tannin and acidity are really important for balance, and particularly with acidity, also for freshness. So I think that's something interesting for me here, that this is clearly an aged wine, clearly a wine from a warm place, but it's still alive. It's got freshness. Finish is quite long. It finishes almost dry, and I somehow found myself thinking about chocolate, and it's not that I think I necessarily taste chocolate, but it's almost a Pavlovian response. I think that I was thinking tawny and chocolate seem to go really, really well together. So, in terms of generic style, clearly, as I've said already, the color's interesting. You're going to find tawny ports in a range of colors, and not always tawny, but definitely some red color still left. In terms of aromas, you're going to find complexity, some oxidative notes, some Maillard notes, toffee, roasted nuts, etc. There will definitely be sweetness, and again with port, I almost think sometimes, from a consumer point of view, people don't really think about it as being a sweet wine. I think. Because it does have, particularly with tawnies and the ruby spectrum, there is quite a lot of tannin. Maybe people's idea is it's sort of dryish, or they're not even thinking about it's dry. It's balanced, and therefore they think that's fine. So, what else could we think about? What other style of port? Obviously, this is a 10-year-old. Clearly, you might think it could be have a longer indication of age. I think Paolo will tell us that if it's got more years of age, then you're going to find more intensity, more complexity. Paolo?
Yeah, you will. Complementing what you were saying is that sometimes we, as we are in the business and we've been working with 10-year-olds for many years, we look it at the tawny already on the dry fruits and caramel side, coffee. But actually the 10-year-old and the tawny reserve, but the 10-year-old most of the time still has a back of fruits on its profile, on its personality. And that's what Peter was saying at his comments on the tasting notes. Red fruits, some red, which is interesting. But sometimes you don't have the pureness of the fruit, but you have the jammy side already, some age and some, but you still have some, probably not some figs and prunes. But you can still feel the fruit, and you can match it with things that you would feel that would be matched with ruby ports or some fruity wines. Chocolates is an excellent example. Probably not dark bitter chocolate, but for a mild, everything that would go with milk chocolate would go perfectly with tawnies.
In terms of blind tasting, what about Colheita? Because I love Colheitas, but I think you know, if you were faced with a really good one with some age and maybe a 20-year-old or 30-year-old, is it easy to tell a difference? I think it's quite hard. It's hard.
I think there are two. How do you say? There are two schools. Those who say, "Oh yes, I can immediately spot a Colheita in the middle of aged tawnies, like a 20-year-old tawny and a Colheita from 1990, from 2000, or a 30-year-old from a Colheita from 1990." This school, because usually it's rougher, it's more edgier, because it doesn't have the balance of a tawny with the ability to blend several different years. There are other people that say, no, it's nearly impossible. It's a style of wine as any other. It was that year, the trade or the company or the house will bottle that particular Colheita because they feel that the wine is balanced and perfect as it is, and it doesn't need more blending, or they don't need that blend to the main. They don't need that year to the main blend of the 30-year-old. So actually, it's also a very well balanced wine that is put in the market, and it's very difficult to find out. So I think you would go for the range. This looks like a 30-year-old, and it could be a Colheita. But immediately spotting a Colheita, I have to be honest, I am from the schools that find it very difficult.
Yeah. Well, of course, I'm always reminded of Michael Broadbent's famous line that one look at the label is worth 50 years in the business. Exactly. So if you know it's Colheita, oh yes, I can tell. Excellent. Okay. In terms of occasions, and I'm really interested to hear what the Soms say here, because I think sometimes maybe having vintage port open can be problematic. Obviously, these days we should have better preservation systems, but I've always thought that tawny was actually really useful for restaurants because it will survive, it will hold up much longer in the bottle. So if you're wanting to serve it by the glass, and I'm prepared to be surprised, but I'm not sure that many people probably sell bottles of port very often, particularly vintage. But you know, maybe you do if it was for a big table. But I think that's one of the things with tawnies, that they do give you this in terms of service. They do give you much more flexibility. Anyone got any thoughts on that? Actually, I can see Emmanuel's too busy coming up with great combinations, actually.
Yeah, that's true.
Emmanuel, do you want to talk us through the crispy Peking duck and tawny port?
Yeah, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah, good.
Perfect. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, it was quite, you know, when you go out, sometimes as a sommelier, you want to switch off. You just want to turn your sommelier life away and let the sommelier in another place just drive you through. And actually, it was an amazing pairing. Actually, the crispy duck, the caramelized skin of the duck, the moisture of that duck pig is absolutely phenomenal. It was an excellent pairing. It was a 20 years old tawny, but still it's a tawny port. I think the retrofaction between both, they were complementing each other from the primary, secondary fruit, even the tertiary. It's because of that lively, generous acidity that Tawny Port has, which was excellent. To come back to your question regarding bottles, at 67 we sell a lot of port by bottle. Maybe because I'm Portuguese, that's another addition. But we do have a huge amount of port as well by Coravin. The Coravin was a revolution system for all of us to be able to add an excellent guest experience throughout a range of wine by the glass and port by the glass that we're able to sell. And the variety, people and members are willing to get out of the safe zone and try something unusual. And in many occasions we do sell ports and Madeiras from large formats as well, to enhance as well the guest capability, because at the end of the day no one can drink a full bottle of port after having 2-3 bottles on the same evening. You want just one glass to finish off the evening in an amazing way. But at 67 we do have, we go from 25 ml to 125 ml, and we're able to do a side-by-side pairings from a Tawny to a vintage to a Collietta, so you're able to see them and to learn about them from the Soms, which they are all quite extremely knowledgeable. The difference, the style, the aging, the oak they use, the aguardente, all this, it's actually a journey. It's a lovely journey of port. And I think since the pandemic, I think people tend to drink a lot of port and Madeiras after dinner, because during the pandemic I believe the consumption of port increased by more than 350% because people were home most of the time and they were started to drink more port than usual, and we can see it at work. It's great to see it, because this is the actually as well, you have England, UK and Portugal. It's always been for many years. It's a tradition. In any function you do, in any lecture you do, you have a port at the end of the meal, and that's very helpful as well, adding history to the consumption of port. And I think it's an amazing pairing. For me, it's daring is pairing. It's if you dare to pair a port with a meal. I think with the cigars as well. I have done a tasting of cigar the other night, and with wine. It's daring, it's pairing. It works really well. We had so many different wines that people never thought they would drink with cigars, as well as ports. I believe Tawny, white ports, it depends on the style of cigar as well. At the same time, many people now start to enhance their evenings by having a cheese platter with port, and as well with Madeiras, and as well with wine at the end of the meal, because of the pandemic. I think there was a positiveness and negativeness for the pandemic, but in general, the consumption of port and champagne, as we all know, increased by more than 300%. Hopefully we have enough port for Christmas and New Year.
No, well, there is port enough here in the cellars for sure. But yes, we are very, two things. We are quite, I wouldn't say surprised, but we are quite happy with the numbers in 2021. They are actually in some countries, I'm not sure with the UK, but I'll check. We are already passing the sales of 2019, which is probably comes to confirm what you were saying. There was probably more awareness in the confinement regarding ports, and the people started experiencing it, and now they are continuing the experience in restaurants. And you also spoke about Madeira, and in your when you made the notes that you put on the box, you said generous acidity, and I think that's also very interesting to see that port usually works very well because the acidity is generous, and the wine we don't get fed up with the amount of sugar. I wouldn't say that the sugar is hidden, but there is a balance, a very good balance between the sugar, the acidity, and the structure that for a fortified wine you can only find in ports, because in Madeira you find the acidity, but then sometimes the structure, because it's white grapes, it's not there. Although I love Madeira, I have to be, and Finos and sherry also. But yes, you were right, and I wanted to emphasize this on the acidity. And also one thing that Peter was saying, that is the opportunities and the length of opportunities that Tawny Port brings, and one of them is surprising the clients or not surprising, but offering the opportunity to clients to change from sauterne, for instance, when going on a pâté or a foie gras, even because sometimes the brioche helps the caramelly side of the brioche and the sugary side of the bread, not only the fatness of the foie gras or the red fruit juice or the coulis sometimes. But if we think about the tasting or the dish of a foie gras, it matches perfectly with a 10-year or a 20-year-old. Yeah. As an opposition or an alternative to sauterne that sometimes it's, depending on the sauterne, is also very sugarish and fruity, primary fruity.
The other thing, when Emmanuel was talking, I was reminded that I've working with consumers on a number of occasions. People have said to me, "Oh, I can't drink port; it gives me a terrible hangover." And I go, "Really?" I said, "So how much port?" "Oh, just one little glass." I said, "So what did you drink before you got to the port?" "Oh, well, I had 2 glasses of champagne, 1 glass of white wine, 3 glasses of red wine." And I say, "And you're blaming the port for your hangover?" You know, I think that is a challenge we still face with sometimes with encouraging people to try fortified wines. And I always explicitly talk about wine. I think I almost don't say fortified, because I think it does sort of set up maybe a subconscious or conscious barrier to people trying, because I think it's too strong.
I believe as well, we have to be very diplomatic as well. Serving 125 ml a glass to someone in the beginning of a meal is a bit of a hard ask, I might say. I think many places in UK, when they adjusted their specific measures to the guest experience, they realized that the bottom line conversion was massive. Instead of serving 125 ml and the guest will not be able to drink another 2 glasses of red wine after it, you could easily serve them a 50 ml or 75 ml, and that will enhance the experience just enough. You just need enough port tawny to complement that meal. You don't want to overwhelm the guest with how much port you're serving on the beginning, and then you can't blame the port anymore. You're going to blame the last wine you had.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, I do love your idea of off, you know, because of Coromant and so on, being able to offer people smaller pours. I think that's a fantastic option, because I also think maybe because we're involved in wine, we probably quite like bigger pours. But I do think that lots of consumers are really happy with a small, but particularly if it gives them a chance to try more things. Okay.
Especially Coravin invented the new system, because all the tawny port we know it's a capsule, it's not a cork. And that's a new system from Coravin.
Your new system, yes, exactly.
Yeah,
fantastic.
You remove and put that, and it works very well.
Okay, I'm slightly conscious of time, so I'm sure everybody's got things to do. So let's look at our third port, and this is the vintage from Porto Cruz. And as you might expect, it's fairly deep in color, although certainly not opaque. I wouldn't quite call it ruby, but maybe ruby red, if that even makes sense to anybody. It works for me as a description. And when you smell it, it's sort of a little bit brambly. Again, that sort of sous-bois, slightly earthy in a good sense. And I sort of want to say it smells of seeds and stems, but I don't think that sounds good. But actually, there is something. I guess that, again, it's that sort of herbaceous undergrowth side, kind of character.
Vegetal side. Vegetal side.
Yeah. But very ripe, dark fruit aromas. And again, when I first was smelling this, I thought, I almost wonder if I could smell some oak. And I don't think there is an oak influence, but there is something, maybe a little sort of sweet spice, perhaps. Mm-hmm. As you'd expect, loads of dark fruit, pleasing sweetness, then a sort of firm tannic dryness kicks in. And again, like the tawny, there's good acidity. And, you know, maybe this is, Paolo and I clearly agree on this, but I think, you know, acidity is really important here. And I'm conscious when I talk to consumers a lot that what we do professionally, sort of taking wines apart, is not how you're supposed to drink them. You know, people drink something, they go, that's nice. They don't often say, oh, that has refreshing acidity, but actually, if they like it, refreshing acidity is probably one of the reasons they like it. So I think, you know, maybe just because we're professionals, it's interesting to talk about that level of acidity. And of course, it brings a kind of a lift and a freshness. I think it's really fruity and drinkable, but that backbone means I think this will continue to age. And I actually found it sort of mouth-watering and chewy on the finish. So, you know, I think this is an example of relatively, you know, it's not in the first flush of youth, but it's certainly not super old. So I think this has a role as a nice open drinking style of vintage port, but you could certainly put it away longer if you wanted to. I think in terms of styles, you know, generally speaking with vintage port, in its younger days, we're going to see more intense aromatic fruitiness, and clearly as it evolves, you're going to get tertiary aromas and all that kind of thing. But you're going to get a big mouthful of fruit. It's got power, it packs a punch, but again, with age, that's going to smooth out. What makes it that way? I guess it's going to be the quality of the fruit from the best vineyards, optimal ripeness, and short wood aging. Now, in a blind tasting, can you be confident could it be an LBV? Could it be a single Quinta? I think again, I think I know the answer. I'm going to ask Paolo to say, you know, LBV, tell us why LBV, even if it's good, is not vintage.
I think to the point that we are tasting a wine that is 22 years old, and you can still feel the strength and the structure of the wine given by that perfect ripeness of the grapes at that time. LBVs don't have. Usually LBVs are fruitier and less structured. So it's on a blind tasting, it's, I don't say easier to find a vintage, but when you get to the extent to understand that the wine has already some age on it, usually the structure and the pureness of the fruits will lead them away from LBVs that usually are not that fresh at this time, unless they were LBVs suited for age, the traditional ones that are labeled and filtered. Of course, they age differently. But most of the LBVs that we have in the restaurants with the cork, the bar top, usually they are more rich in terms of primary fruits and black fruit and red fruit, but they don't come 20 years later to this aliveness that I think you can find on this 1999 vintage that you said, of course, is not completely young, but it's aging very well, and now it's good. I think that's how you can define it, because usually structure defines a vintage. A good vintage from a good LBV. Yeah.
I mean, on that subject, you're talking about age. I think sometimes with vintage port, you could be surprised how much color they hold on to. Like you know, they look maybe certainly if it was a red wine, they look younger than the comparative red wine. And I think that's a really good point to remember in terms of blind tasting, certainly.
It is, yes, and it is possible that the spirit also holds color for more time, something that the regular wines don't have. If you think about Shiraz or a Cabernet Sauvignon, it will be more difficult. They will get, well, Cabernet and also have Bordeaux blend. They also have the Merlot, but sometimes the color is also kept because of this, what is inside the bottle. And you're talking about 20 degrees in alcohol from a wine that have enormous content of polyphenols and color when it was created during the vintage. So that also helps the wine to keep the joviality and the color longer.
Yeah. In terms of pairings, clearly dark chocolate desserts are a no-brainer. And cheese, I mean, you know, the old Port and Stilton is a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason, and that's that it actually works. And I think, you know, strong flavored cheese will work as well. But has anybody, I'm interested, has anybody ever tried vintage port with maybe a main course? Anyone had any luck with that?
You must.
I
It goes
mean,
very well with venison.
Yeah.
And game. It works very well, especially if it's a kind of wine like this with 20, 25 years vintage or LBV, and
Yeah.
a little bit more aged LBVs. If the rubies are fruitier, you can go for sauces and steaks.
It's interesting because venison can have almost have a kind of bitterness to it, and in fact, the English love grouse, and grouse, if it's been feeding on heather, can definitely have a bitterness to it. So that would be a really interesting one.
Yeah.
I think we might need to wrap up here, but I do have a question about storage, Paul. I don't know if you can see it in the chat.
Yeah.
Would you like to address that?
Let me see, where is it? Well, I'll go for the generic side. There are two things very important: storage and temperatures. As you, I have to repeat this, but probably this audience already knows it. We're talking about a wine higher in sweetness and in alcohol, so we should serve all ports chilled, even the tawnies and the rubies, not more than 14, 16 degrees, because they will then eat up in the table of the client. So we don't have to be worried about serving it more, I wouldn't say colder, but to serve it at 20, 22. So storage, it's very important for us, to the extent that we have to keep it at a middle temperature between the cold and the room temperature. That's very important for rubies, for tawnies, for vintage LBVs also. They have more tannins, they support a higher temperature, but tawnies at 12, 14 degrees, for us, it's very important because I think it will enhance the experience of the client. Regarding all the wines that have full corks, they have to be decanted, and they won't last. They last as long as any other red wine that you pour and you serve, 3, 4, 5 days in good conditions. They were not in oxygen when they aged. So if it's full cork, then it's a ruby, not for tawny. Sometimes some tawnies already come full corked because of a question of image and packaging. But if the wines come with a full cork, they will just have 4 or 5 days of longevity. I wouldn't say that 24 hours, this myth of the vintage will only last 24 hours, but of course, you know that if you open a very old wine, a Burgundy or a Bordeaux, the wine will not be exactly the same as the day after the day he was opened. And so if the wine has a bar top, or if it's a tawny, it will last for 3-4 months in good conditions. Just don't keep it over the coffee machine. Okay, that's my recommendation.
Excellent. Does anybody have any further questions at all about in general, or about anything specific? Fantastic. Well, all that remains is for me to thank you for your time, because I know time is at a premium these days. You probably don't need reminding that the online test is on November the 15th, 9 o'clock in the morning. So can I say thank you, Paolo? That was great. Thank you to all of you for your presence, for your contributions, and good health. Enjoy the rest of your day, and good luck when you do the test. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much to you all also, and hope to see you all in Portugal next year, but hope to see some of you for sure. Thank you very much. Thank you.